Now, staying with the US, more bizarre things are happening there. The Alabama Supreme Court delivered a ruling. Every state has a Supreme Court in the US. The one in Alabama has come up with the first of its kind decision. And what does it say? Frozen embryos are children. I'll repeat that for you. Frozen embryos are children. That's what the court says. What does that mean? Human eggs are often fertilized outside the uterus. It's through a process called IVF, in vitro fertilization. Usually more eggs are fertilized than needed. The remaining ones are stored, maybe even destroyed later. That's how IVF works. Now that the court has ruled these embryos are children, it's raised a lot of questions. Is IVF still viable? Can patients store unused embryos? Can clinics destroy extra embryos? Can other American states take similar steps? Our next report tells you.
In 2020, a patient snuck into a freezer at the Mobile Infirmary Medical Center. It was where the clinic stored fertilized embryos. The patient wandered into this room. They dropped a few trays. It contained the embryos. They were destroyed. It belonged to 3 couples, so they decided to sue the clinic. The case reached the Alabama Supreme Court. It ruled that frozen embryos can be considered children under state law. This is what Justice J. Mitchell wrote. Unborn children are children without exception based on developmental stage, physical location, or any other ancillary characteristics. So if embryos are children, they are entitled to the same rights as children. That means those couples can sue the facility for wrongful death. But the implications will not just be restricted to this case. This could affect the whole of Alabama. Sometimes human eggs are fertilized outside the uterus. It's through a process called IVF. In vitro fertilization. The ovaries are stimulated. It produces multiple eggs. These eggs are extracted. Experts fertilize these eggs in a laboratory. So embryos are created in the lab. Doctors then transfer an embryo or 2 into the patient's uterus. The others are stored for future use. IVF is often used in cases of infertility or when the patient requires external medical help or if they want to bear children at an older age. At least 2 million people use it worldwide every year. And in America, the number is on the rise. An average IVF treatment costs $12,400 in the US. Yet more people are using it than ever before. Which brings us to the extra embryos. They are usually stored with the patient's consent. They can keep it if they want a child later. But at some point, the stored embryos are destroyed or even used for medical research like testing. All with the patient's consent, of course. But the Alabama court's decision has thrown all of this into jeopardy. If every embryo is a child, that means you cannot store or freeze embryos. It won't be legally viable under state law. Then there's the destruction. Usually more embryos are fertilized than needed. Most times they're destroyed. But after this ruling, can they be destroyed anymore? If you're a doctor, you could be charged with manslaughter. If you're a clinic, you could be charged with wrongful death. The medical provider will then have 2 options. Either extract fewer eggs, reducing the chances of fertilization, or they could transfer all created embryos to the patient. That means patients can be pregnant with twins, triplets, quadruplets, even if they don't want more than a single child. Right now, Alabama doesn't know what the implications could look like, but it has sent clinics and doctors scrambling. Until now, IVF was seen as a way to start a family. The recent ruling has raised questions about it. It may not be illegal yet in Alabama, but it makes the process riskier and definitely more expensive for both patients and doctors.